Hello, Heathens. Welcome to another episode. I don't even know what I'm calling it these days, so just welcome. I have the one and only, the incomparable Candida Moss. Hello.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for agreeing. I right before we got on started recording, I asked how to pronounce your name, and I thought it was Candida, and it is not. So for everyone that's listening out there, put some respect on her name. And I'm curious, where did that name come from? Do you know?
I mean, it's sort of a family name. It
Hmm.
is more common in England. It feels like it takes a kind of special kind of ignorance to name your daughter after not one, but two kinds of fungus. It's almost like a joke. People comment on it all the time when they send me hate mail. They're like, "P.S. Your name is stupid." I'm like, I know. We're in
People,
agreement. And I've definitely like asked my parents, what were you thinking? Like I'm child two. I'm not like child 1,000 where
it
you're
wasn't
really
like the test child, and you ran out of ideas at a certain point.
but I think they thought it sounded pretty. It is the name of a Catholic martyred saint. She was apparently pagan princess, executed for becoming Christian. And her tomb is in England, but it turns out not a princess, not a woman or a martyr, and in fact, not human. So,
All right. Well, I mean, it is a pretty name, I think. Uh, However, as someone who has a very, very common name that's spelled just slightly different, I understand the sort of just shaking the head of it all because people regularly, the number of people that still just spell my name with an I that I've given up on, I'm like, it's fine. That's whatever. Spell it however you want. I, K, whatever.
yeah.
In any event, um, so many of you out there may already know that our friend here, Candida, has written a book called The Myth of Persecution. It's actually how I first learned about her. When I was sort of deconstructing and then leaving the church, I read voraciously. And yours was one of the books that I came across. And it sort of was a shock to my system in a good way. But because I grew up in like late 90s, early 2000s evangelicalism, the like DC talk, Book of Martyrs, and like, the end is coming and we're all going to be put to death. And like, that was my childhood. So to pick up a book and learn that like, actually Christians might not have been as persecuted as we were led to believe. And if they were, it likely wasn't because they believed in this Jesus as a Messiah. It was for a variety of other reasons. And so I was wondering if maybe for people that haven't read the book, you could sort of give them a general just overview.
Yeah, so like you, I grew up hearing the story about the disciples and their followers and the early generations of Christians living under attack. They were hiding in the catacombs in Rome. They had a fish symbol.
Yes.
They died in their thousands. And what could be a better testament to the truth of Christianity than this? That so many people would go die for their religious beliefs. And then as I grew up and went to grad school and started looking into it, I really loved the stories. I wrote two books about martyrdom and about the stories before I got to Myth of Persecution. But it was really clear to me that academics knew, and in fact, people had known for about 400 years, that there were a whole bunch of martyrdom stories that simply were just inventions, adaptations of Buddhist myths, stories that are about greyhounds that are also in Lady and the Tramp. These are not martyred people even sometimes. And over the past 400 years, this was so well known that Catholic priests themselves were sort of, we need to get rid of some of these fanciful stories that are not true, the forgeries. And so they had been kind of culling the kind of like canon of martyrdom stories, if you will. But it didn't feel to me that my Sunday school education had caught up to that. We're about 400 years behind. And then I took my first job at Notre Dame. And it was the late 2000s. It was very quickly the Barack Obama years. And all I heard about was Christians being under attack and being persecuted, just like in the early church. And it was all over the media. It was in the news. And I was just sort of, I feel fine. Like you, and not to mention that they kept talking about the martyrs in the early church. And one day I was walking behind two students and they were talking about this just atrocious case of a young girl in Brazil who had gotten pregnant and her mother had taken her to get a termination from a doctor because she was 9 years old. She was pregnant with twins. She was obviously a rape victim. She wasn't going to survive carrying twins full time because she's tiny. Right. And she had been excommunicated, and they were talking about how this is what happens when Christians are persecuted, and how they couldn't feel sorry for this girl because she had committed murder, this 9-year-old child. And I was really struck by the lack of feeling there. They're like, let's say that you're 100% abortion is murder. Can you still not feel sorry for a 9-year-old rape victim? Right. Truly? And listening to them talk, it occurred to me that the reason they thought this was because they were caught in this like apocalyptic worldview of us versus them. They're attacking us, they're harming us. And I thought this comes from this myth about persecution that Christians had. And so I wrote a book.
Yeah, I actually saw someone on Twitter the other day say that it's open season on Christians. And I just cannot understand. I can't understand because I grew up in it. And so you're taught to see reality in a very, very specific way. And that way is that like, this is a battle between good and evil, and everything is demonic, and so you're always having to be on guard, and like it's very militaristic, which is odd considering Jesus. But it's just so wild that you could live in the United States right now and think that it's Christians that are being harmed and persecuted. Like.
Right, especially right now. So when I published the book, it was 2013, and people were like, what are you talking about? Because we had a Democratic president. We had real movements for marriage equality. Things were changing, in my view, for the better. But you could see why some conservatives might be concerned. If you had been, if you'd grown up in the 80s and you'd heard from the moral majority about how feminism, it is always women. Feminism and secularization would lead to such unbelievable shifts like marriage equality, which is not the language, like same-sex marriage, then you were right. So in 2013, I think when I wrote this book, conservatives felt very under attack. They didn't have political power. But right now, when you look at the Dobbs verdict, when you look at our Supreme Court, when you look at the stranglehold that conservative Christians have on the Supreme Court and on legislation, and you couple that with the fact that someone like Samuel Alito seems to think that just the existence of people who are secular is somehow an attack on Christianity, it's hard to understand how they can think that they're persecuted. And in some ways, to my mind, I wish I'd been wrong, but the best proof that I was correct is that here we are, Christians are more powerful than they've been in 20 years, conservative Christians. And yet it's open season on them because not everybody agrees.
Yeah, I think people are very, very confused. Having someone that doesn't agree with you or is like mean to you on the internet is not persecution. Like, it's just someone that doesn't like you or what you're saying. And oftentimes it like when I talk about racism with folks and they'll say like something about reverse racism, and I just shake my head because like it's impossible. It's impossible. White people built this power structure, right? Like we built it, we put ourselves at the top. And just because someone is fighting back against that doesn't mean I'm being persecuted. But it's this very hard concept for people because it makes them very uncomfortable. And I think it's the same with Christians. If they have to sort of try and reckon with this idea that other people having the same rights as them doesn't they think it detracts, it takes something from them, as opposed to just putting everyone sort of on a level playing field. And I think it's very, very much rooted, as you were saying, in this apocalyptic worldview that Christians have sort of had for a while now, and thinking that it somehow makes them a better Christian or like more like Jesus if they're being persecuted. And so they seek out persecution. And because they're not actually persecuted, they come up with these like wild ideas about what persecution is. Anyway, I digress. Sorry. I have very strong feelings about this. Can you give folks an idea of what the first century sort of was like for Christians after Jesus was crucified?
Yeah. So Jesus is crucified. And I think like everyone will agree that it's Jesus and he was crucified. And really that should have been the end of the Jesus movement. It wasn't. And the reason it wasn't is very much related to this persecution myth. There was clearly something in his teaching that suggested he expected to suffer and die. Prior to this, if your religious leader was executed like a common criminal, that was a sign that you did not have divine backing, or that you were very angry with you indeed. But Christianity reversed all of that. But in the aftermath, it does not appear that the Romans were looking even for the disciples, even for Jesus's followers. And it doesn't appear that the Romans even know who Christians are until the end of the first century. That's when the word first comes into use. And for Romans to be targeting people, they need to know who they're targeting. Otherwise, we're just talking about Jews. The fact that the Romans don't know who they are suggests that the Romans cannot be persecuting them. And part of this is about what do you mean by persecution? And if you mean someone is out to get you, then that is not happening. It doesn't appear that the Romans even know who they are. They will always execute someone who is a rabble-rouser, who might cause a rebellion, who says something that sounds like treason. And by the way, talking about how you have your own special king and his name is Jesus does sound like treason to a Roman judge. But they will always execute people for that, but they're not looking for Christians. And so what do we know about, say, I think famously, regardless of your denomination, the deaths of the apostles? You know, Peter, you might have seen that movie from the 50s or 60s. Paul, you probably heard the story somewhere. Peter executed upside down when he's crucified, things like that. Those stories mostly come from between 100 years after the events and 400 years after the event. That's a big time span. I can barely remember what happened 5 years ago. 100 years ago?
I mean, I lost my train of thought in the middle of a sentence, let alone hundreds of years ago.
Yeah, but even I think the most striking thing is when you read the stories about the deaths of the apostles, the earliest stories. I'm thinking like the ones written in the 2nd century, the sort of kernel of the story about the execution of Peter. When you read those stories, they don't say the Romans were targeting Christians because they believed Jesus was God, or they had a Trinity, or they hate Christians. The Romans don't like the apostles because they're telling people to stop having sex with them. No one likes someone who kind of gets in the way of their love life. But I think in no way is that religious persecution. Nothing about those stories suggests that the Roman authorities are going after Christians for being Christians. Right. Now, of like real non-Christian evidence for Romans even thinking about killing Christians comes from the early 2nd century. And there you have someone, his name is Pliny, who's the governor of Bithynia Pontus in northern Turkey. He writes to the emperor. He's a nephew of the more famous Pliny, the one who died in Pompeii. So Pliny's like, I have these Christians. They were in fact,
what am I doing?
What do I do with them? Because they really seem to be disrupting the local economy. Again, he's not concerned about what Christians think or believe.
Right.
He just doesn't want this new kind of low status superstition, he calls it, kind of disrupting people. And he doesn't want to have the kind of temple he built not be attended. He doesn't want any kind of disruption to the local economy. But this certainly isn't about the threat that Christianity posed to the Roman Empire or anyone thinking about what these Christians think is wrong.
Right. Can you, pardon me, can you speak a little bit more, because this is something I either forgot or just didn't realize. So they didn't like Christians because they were telling them not to have sex.
So this is the narrative story. So in all of these stories, the plot is pretty much always the same. It's like watching some kind of high school rom-com. Like, you know what the plot is. Yeah. And in fact, people have compared them to romance novels. So in the story, you have your apostle, he's traveling around, he's converting people. He converts someone, usually the wife or the beloved of some important Roman authority figure. And she's like, I love Jesus now. Jesus is going to be my groom. I couldn't possibly marry that man / have sex with him again. And so that man, who turns out to be pretty important, decides to have the apostle executed. So what they're preaching is what we call asceticism or sexual renunciation. And they don't want to see Christians in general being immoral. This is an extraordinary set of sexual regulations, especially for men. But it seems that when you look at the Romans who actually have power, who are executing Christians in these stories, which are a little bit fanciful, right? There are like talking animals, flying magicians, like Harry Potter style duels. But even in these stories, the Romans who are responsible for executing Christians are really acting out of some sort of personal motivation, right. That they won't have sex with them anymore. They're not really like, Christians are bad and I, a good follower of Jupiter, don't want Christians. You know, it's not a religious motivation at all. It's a sort of personal one. And that's on the Christian side.
So when you talk about these stories being invented sort of much later, or later and much later in some cases, why do you know why those people chose to invent those stories at those times?
Yeah, we do. So as Christianity becomes more powerful, and after Constantine, who becomes like the first Christian emperor on his deathbed, which is always how you should convert, on your deathbed, no room for post-baptismal sin.
I mean, when I die, I'm just going to pray to all the gods and just like cover my bases. Hopefully one of them lets me in. Yeah.
Right. Definitely. And there are definitely some you should avoid now because you get a second chance after you die. Right. I will make those jokes another day. But after Constantine makes the Roman world much more amenable to Christians, in fact, makes it Christian, you might say, although it's a process. After Constantine does that, we see an explosion in the writing of martyrdom stories. Now, there were periods, brief periods of persecution, but people are editing the same stories and rewriting them. And there are all kinds of reasons why. One is very straightforward. They're just great stories. People love these stories. They read them at cemeteries. They held parties. I like parties. I want to go dance in a cemetery and read a martyrdom story and eat honey cakes.
Sorry, I need to know more about this dancing in a cemetery. Not to interrupt your train of thought, but this sounds like personally something I might want to do, but also very interesting.
So Augustine, you know, the famous Augustine, complains about this. His mother, Monica, who is a Catholic saint, used to go to the cemeteries to celebrate the feast days of the saints with honey cakes and things. And this is actually just kind of an outgrowth of funerary practice in general. So you have a family member and they die and you mourn them, you bury them, and then you return every year to like pour out a little offering for them, a libation, and kind of eat with them. And there's an idea that the dead is very thirsty, and so they like drinking the drinks, and so you take cakes too. And these are celebratory occasions, and apparently could get like a little out of hand. This is very different different from the 3 to 4 hour church services Augustine is hosting. And he complained, people aren't coming to hear me speak. Instead, they're going to do this. And you kind of can't blame them. My apologies for any devotees of St. Augustine out there, but that's the thing people are doing. So it is fun. And the thing about martyrdom stories is you can really connect with these people. They kind of feel like us. They're like heroes. They're like celebrities. And often they have a kind of a local history. So they're from the area that you're in. And so people feel very personally connected to these stories. Whereas someone like Jesus or John the Baptist might feel a little more removed. So that's one reason. One other reason people are editing those stories is actually the kind of, because there is so much interest in them, there's a good financial investment in writing stories to found cults, to get tourists to come, to have them pay for the honey cakes or the wine. And that really exploded in the medieval period. But another reason is to try and control people's beliefs. So the thing about martyrs is they're dead. Also,
infamously.
Yeah, it's in the name. There are also these paragons of virtue. These are the people who got it right. And so if you put words into the mouth of a martyr, then you can use that martyr as a spokesperson for your own positions on things like what it is to be orthodox or what real Christians should do. People still do this, right?
Yes.
Wildly misquote scripture, or Jesus would do X, Y, Z, and you're like, what? Jesus
did he tell you that? Where are you getting this from?
And it might be an interpretation, but there's often, a lot of God, a lot of people think the phrase God helps those who help themselves is in the Bible, and indeed it is not.
No, it is not.
But you can see it out there as a quote. And so people use martyrs to kind of shore up their own position, especially when they're trying to battle or counteract the popularity of people that they see as heretics. There's a whole bunch of reasons why, not least of all, they're just good stories.
Well, we're going to take it to the cemetery and dance around and talk about dead people. Sounds kind of like witchcraft, but I don't know, maybe early Christianity. So something that I found really interesting when I sort of started down this path of trying to figure out, did these people really die for their faith? Is that we don't really know much about how the apostles died at all. We kind of lose track of them, most of them, after, the end of Jesus's life, or the end of the Gospels anyway. I'm wondering if you can speak to what historical evidence, if any, that we have for the martyrdom of the apostles, disciples, early Christians.
Yeah. I don't want to ruin anyone's day. I
do.
Okay. Well, it depends what you think is historical evidence.
Sure.
Really. We have stories from about 100 years later. We have some early evidence that Peter and Paul died. We don't know how. Our earliest version of that story, which comes from a letter that's known as First Clement, but was not by Clement, says that Peter and Paul died because of, and I quote, jealousy. And that's a word that refers to kind of internal jealousy. So nothing about that. It makes it sound like someone in the community betrayed them. It seems to be identifying someone inside the group as the reason that they died. But we learn nothing about how they died. So no being executed upside down out of humility. You don't get that.
What is that rooted in?
So there is a story that says that he's executed upside down. It's in the Acts of Peter, which is a 2nd century text. But the idea that he's executed upside down out of humility, that's a 4th century idea, because the 2nd century text is not orthodox. It is what is sometimes referred to as a Gnostic text. But, Peter's a little important to Roman Catholics. And so, we don't go with the Gnostic version.
Right, yeah.
So So that takes like really 400 years to come to maturity, that idea. But I think when people really think about what's the evidence, because we don't have the evidence for the apostles, I assume that they did die. I think it's like,
I hope.
or reveal yourselves.
Exactly. I'll be here all day.
That would be compelling evidence, I think. But I expect that they did die, probably because of a combination of just annoying people, very annoying, seeming politically subversive, seeming socially subversive. But like, we don't have the data. I'm really giving Christianity the benefit of the doubt.
Right.
I think when people think about it, what they think about is the fire of Rome, and the story that in the aftermath of the fire of Rome, in which Nero apparently fiddled on a yet non-existent violin, he then killed a bunch of Christians. And that idea comes about 60 years after the events. And what is the best piece of evidence against that theory is that there are no Christians writing. This Great Fire of Rome happens in 64. We're told it happens. Nero blames Christians and kills a bunch of Christians in these brutal ways. No Christians in the 70s or 80s or 90s talk about it. Why don't they reference it? Our earliest evidence comes from Suetonius and Tacitus, Roman historians who hate Nero, who are writing once Christians have gotten on the Roman radar. The classicist Brent Shaw has a wonderful piece called The Myth of the Neronian Persecution, which came out after my book, I would say. But I guess I say that to say I'm not alone in thinking that Nero probably didn't kill any Christians. He probably killed someone.
Sure.
Christians. There wasn't persecution of Christians. And sometimes people think that that was when some of the apostles died, but there's no reference to that in any of our sources. That's just sort of a Christian myth.
Tradition? Like, that is really interesting, because I sort of always thought that too, even after I realized that like Christians probably weren't that persecuted. I assumed that after the fire that what I had been told was that Nero persecuted Christians or killed Christians or blamed Christians or did whatever. And I thought like, no, that makes sense. But it's pretty wild to me how much Christians today, and myself included when I was a Christian, are told things about history that just didn't happen. They just didn't happen.
And they're not alone in describing things that didn't happen.
Right.
They're not the only people who misrepresent their history in this way.
Right.
And it's not as if I like go around to people's houses and tell their children that the tooth fairy doesn't exist.
Right.
I think the reason why this is problematic is precisely because of how people misuse this mythology today. I would have less of a problem with it if people weren't pretending that they're persecuted and connecting themselves to this lineage of non-existent martyrs.
Right. In your book, you mentioned a story about Christians seeking out martyrdom. And I love that story because I just find it so funny. But I was wondering if you might talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, so there are a few examples of this, of Christians seeking out martyrdom. People call it voluntary martyrdom because they don't want it to sound like suicide, both because that's supposed to be sin, and also because one of the ways that people distinguish between Christian martyrdom, which is good, and all other kinds of martyrdom is, well, we're not suicidal, not like Muslim martyrs. But there are a bunch of them. So the first people we know who tried to do this in the 2nd century, apparently a crowd of 2,000 Christians knock on the door of a Roman procurator in the night and ask to become martyrs for Christ. And he tells them if they want to die, they have ropes to hang themselves with, and slams the door in their face.
Get off my lawn. I'm trying to sleep.
Yet more evidence that they're not persecuting Christians, because he's not even like, well, I guess maybe I should kill you now. He's like, just go away.
Leave me alone. You guys are annoying. Yeah.
And then we have like martyred saints. I'm not exactly sure which one you mean, because there are so many. There are those who just volunteer that they're Christians in situations where clearly they're going to be executed if they admit to it, and they're just a bystander. There's a woman who throws herself into a pyre that had been lit for 2 other martyrs. She throws off her cloak, says that she's this was the meal that was prepared for herself, and then she throws herself into the flames, which is bold. Then there's a word for it. Yeah, this one's stunning to me. There's a man called Euplus who goes into a Roman courtroom with a sword, starts trying to kill people. He's not good at it, but starts to actual Roman soldiers. They killed him, and he's hailed as a martyr. And it feels like they were just defending themselves. So there are some stories.
Yeah. Do we have any, I'm going to assume no, but something that I heard so much growing up was how Christians were thrown to the arena and forced, in with the lions and torn apart by wild animals. And I'm curious if we really have much evidence for that, because it sounds like maybe they were, but not because they were Christians, for some other reason.
We do. We do have evidence for this. And I should say this. Just because very few Christians died doesn't mean no Christians died. Some Christians did die. And that would have had a profound impact on the community, on a small community. My mother died when I was in my 20s, and I'm still not over it. So just the death of a few people could really deeply affect you. We do have evidence for that, primarily from North Africa. They have more wild beasts there. The myth around this is the Colosseum. That my husband has hold me back from tour guides in Rome. He's sort of take us to the Colosseum, because they will tell you when you were there that after the fire of Rome, the Christians were thrown to the lions here. The Colosseum wasn't even here then. It's not done. And in terms of were Christians thrown to the lions as entertainment? Yeah, some of them were, just as other criminals were. So it wasn't only Christians. Lots of kinds of criminals, usually lower status criminals, died in the arenas, but you were more likely to just be beheaded than you were to be thrown to the lions. It's just that we remember those stories. And especially when people started shall we say, fabricating those stories or expanding them or making them more dramatic, sort of like a competitive horror movie thing where they're just worse and worse. It was those kinds of scenes that got expanded. And those are the ones that stick in people's memories.
Yeah, no kidding. I swear I thought half the Christians in Rome ended up in the arena getting eaten by animals, or at least torn apart by animals. So I'm a little bit taken aback by the fact that the Colosseum didn't even exist all the way then.
They were not, that was not happening in the 60s. Christians don't say that it was. That's a really amazing thing. These are later myths that spring up. But no first century Christians are claiming that they're being thrown to the lions.
Right. And it seems like that would be something that you would write down, maybe, if you're writing things.
It feels important. Because they do talk about being socially marginalized, outcasts, and they do expect to be persecuted, which is exactly those little snippets about take up your cross and follow me.
Right, yeah.
Or that when you're thrown in courtrooms, things like that, those little snippets, those kind of are the seeds of the persecution mythology. Right. So you would think they would bring it up.
You think so? Can you speak a little bit to maybe some of the Roman laws that Christians were violating, that they were then being sort of brought in for or punished for?
Yeah, I can. So it depends on the time period. First and second century, let's just say. What are they being? Well, Pliny says that he kind of thinks that they should be executed just because they're so stubborn and annoying. Literally what he says. He says they're stubborn. They're non-citizens. they're enslaved women. How dare they disobey someone so higher up the hierarchical chain than them? So there's definitely just that sense. That's not a law, though.
Right.
After the Pliny-Trajan correspondence, after they write that letters, there's now a sort of principle established that if a Christian refuses to recant their beliefs, then they should be executed. But that's nowhere implemented in any kind of sort of systematic way. And at the same time, they're very careful, Pliny and Trajan, to say you can't have anonymous denouncements. Like someone has to come forward and say this person is a Christian. They're not looking for anyone, because otherwise people will just try to claim sort of business advantage by accusing people of being Christians.
Right,
and
yeah.
They don't really seem that interested. Where they really run afoul is in the middle of the 3rd century, in 250. The Emperor Decius, who was like a military emperor, he's trying to get unity in the empire. So he says everybody has to offer a sacrifice, which is just like some incense. And everyone has to offer that by sprinkling some incense in a flame and saying a little oath, and then we'll give them a piece of paper saying that they said the oath. It's not clear who has to do this. Is it just like the head of household? Is it everybody? How are they checking on this? Right?
It seems like a lot of people to keep track of.
Yeah. But it seems, so in that situation, if a Christian was brought to court and they refused to do it, then they might end up dying. That would be a law that they ran afoul of. But most Christians just stayed home and felt very good about themselves.
I'm sure they did.
They're like the martyrs because they just stayed home. A bunch of Christians just kind of crossed their fingers and did it anyway, and then asked for forgiveness afterwards. And then around the turn of the 4th century, the Emperor Diocletian also tries to enact unity with a series of regulations where he says that there are 4 of them. At first, it's just like leaders, and he confiscates Christian property. He wants the sort of leaders to offer sacrifice. And then the 4th edict says that all Christians have to swear an oath or they will die. That 4th edict never implemented in the Latin West, only seems to have been in effect for a couple of years. Christians did die then, that's real legislation. But now we're 400 years into Christianity. And when that starts, the first thing that happens under Diocletian's series of legislation is they knock down a church that is across the street, like caddy corner across the street from the imperial palace. So they're not in hiding. They're building churches across the street from imperial residences. Nobody's hiding. So that's bad. I think what happened in Diocletian, that's the persecution I imagined in my head as a child.
Right.
And it's very bad. But it's just a brief period of time. It's not a continuous chain of persecution and martyrdom that begins with Jesus and goes to tomorrow. So there is legislation.
Sorry to interrupt. When you say non-citizens, can you explain a little bit how citizenship would have worked and why Christians wouldn't have been considered citizens in Rome?
Mm-hmm. Some Christians would have been citizens. So if you're a citizen, but that takes a minute. Paul probably is a citizen. So if you're a citizen, what it means is you are entitled to a trial, like a real trial in front of the emperor, and you're entitled to a better kind of death, like by beheading. Right. Really, non-citizens who are out in the provinces outside of Italy, they're the ones who it's a kind of haphazard system. And really it comes down to what is the temperament of your local magistrate? Are they having a bad day? Because in that kind of situation, they can get a little trigger happy. And that's not necessarily about Christianity. And it should be noted that Christians, after a while, you do have a lot of Roman citizens, even in the emperor's household itself, who are Christians. But they find ways around the legislation. So, for example, rather than having to swear an oath to the emperor or, swear an oath by Roman deities, they'll just have like a lawyer do their kind of legal paperwork for them so that they don't have to engage in that. So they found loopholes, they found ways around it, just as like affluent people today find ways around paying their taxes. Christians in antiquity found ways around, having to do what the Roman emperor said.
I'm jumping back just a little bit. I want to talk about the catacombs because that also was something that I grew up with, that like Christians were hiding underground and they, were stuck there for all these years. And what is that rooted in? What actually happened? What can we know? What do we know?
Well, first off, have you been to the catacombs in Rome?
No, not yet, and I really want to go.
When you go, you'll realize how ridiculous this is. Very, very small. It is not that hard to find people. People know where they are. Okay, so people weren't living there.
I sincerely thought it was like Pan's Labyrinth down there or something. You're going to get lost forever, and like maybe there's the Minotaur or something. Because you might never come back.
Yeah, there are underground cities in Turkey, but they're so big that literally everyone is going into them. They're really not a great hiding place. Everyone knows who they're. And they flourish much later and much earlier, so the timing's all off. But in Rome, the catacombs, it's a tourist myth. It's a 19th century, 18th century tourist myth for wealthy, like the grand tour of Europe that Americans used to do and Brits used to do, that thing. It's a tourist myth for those wealthy, like early 20s tourists. Come see the catacombs. And of course, the money they brought in sponsored excavating the catacombs. So the most important thing to know is that in antiquities, those catacombs had like buildings on top of them, identifiable buildings where Christians met. So in terms of like, were they hiding in the catacombs? They were probably just in those buildings that everybody knew where they were. If Romans want to come find you, they just go to the building. No one was like hiding in the catacombs. The evidence for the catacombs is that sometimes they would go in there. We found like a bunch of shattered glass in there. It seems like there was some kind of drinking thing happening down there that involved like smashing glasses. They seem to have been deliberately smashed. So they do go down there and have some kind of celebratory thing, but they're not hiding. These are probably just the kind of funeral rituals I was mentioning before. And honestly, they're not big enough. And they were very easy to find. I don't think there's anyone who truly thinks, other than those people in the 18th and 19th century, that the Christians were hiding in the catacombs. The startling thing is when you hear, so Pope Francis a couple of years ago talked about Christians hiding in the catacombs. I was like, no.
It didn't happen. Yeah, I guess if I had ever applied, critical thought, which was discouraged growing up, if I had ever applied critical thought to that, it makes perfect sense. Like, did the Christians secretly dig the catacombs and then hide down there? Like, no, someone had to. It's an undertaking to do that.
Yeah, and there are Jewish catacombs too, and no one thinks anyone hid in those. But yeah, no, they're not the only ones burying underground. And yes, were they tunneling underground without anyone's knowledge? That actually has happened. There was like a case in Canada kind of recently, and that guy became like a hero for building a big tunnel underneath a public park. Oh. But they weren't doing that. They didn't have the equipment. They didn't have the time. They weren't hiding. But it is a very persuasive tourist legend. Didn't it make you want to go to the catacombs?
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. I get why people would make these things up. It's just, again, I feel like a broken record. It's just wild to me how much of this people take as fact and then sort of make it part of their identity. And it's all just founded on nothing. Not much, anyway. And
it would be less problematic if it didn't, cause harm today. And if it hadn't historically just the idea that you should embrace suffering for Christ.
Right.
The burden of that instruction has always disproportionately fallen on women and marginalized people. And which is why recent canonized women in the Catholic Church have always somehow been caught up in the culture wars. They've always been women who didn't seek medical treatment rather than have a termination. That's a politically driven choice, and it's supposed to teach people to behave in a certain way. And it's certainly the case that stories of martyrdom have always been used to inculcate a particular kind of disposition in Christians, which is never good for less powerful members of those groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, at least when I think about it, even in the story of Peter, where he's being crucified upside down because he's so humble, like, what is that telling people, right? That's telling people that this is a virtue that you should strive for. And oftentimes those virtues are very much, don't rebel, don't question authority, don't challenge the people above you. And of course, that's good for empire, right? It's good for people in charge. It's good for everybody but the person doing it half the time. And that's not to say like being humble isn't a good thing. It's just when you think about sort of the concepts around all of it, like, who is this benefiting? So one of my last questions here is about the symbol of the fish, because good Lord, did I hear a lot about that as a child and young adult, and how it was like this secret symbol, and you drew one half, and if the other person drew the other, they were a Christian. And I always thought, like, you would look like a total weirdo just going around drawing a half fish and like looking at another person and seeing if they do it, and then have them look at you like you're insane. And like, eventually it doesn't take long for it not to be a very secret symbol anymore, because you have a bunch of people going around acting strange.
Yeah, no, this doesn't happen. This did not happen. Enough fish graffitied on the walls of catacombs or whatever. It's a really compelling idea, and it's very clear that it's a really popular bumper sticker. But no, if you wanted to find other Christians, you would go to Christian meetings. They weren't that hard to find. They were like clubs, and there were plenty of private member clubs, and you could go. And frankly, in order for you to become a Christian, you would already be hooked into a network of Christians. Just like any other kind of social network, they don't have like secret handshakes or symbols or graffiti art that they're using to identify themselves, because they don't have to.
Yeah, I think that's maybe a really important point. I don't know, and you do, if they have churches in the sense that we do today. I was brought up being told that they met in houses, but it was like in secret, which is just wild to me. But what would it have been like to be a Christian and want to go to a place of worship or gathering? Would it have been a house? Would it have been more of like a church that we think of it today, at least in the early, like the 1st and 2nd century?
Yeah, so that the house idea is probably right. But there are a range of different kind of domestic structures that we'll be talking about. And often we'll be talking about those kind of apartment blocks. In, say, ancient Rome, they had these like multi-level apartment blocks where people might have met there in rooms. People might have kind of been in bigger assembly halls that were used for Jewish congregations. Like they might have gone to synagogues. They might have gone in these bigger assembly halls that were used by, they were called voluntary associations. They were kind of like clubs for what we might call like the middle class, like artisanal workers, like bakers, fish, And so they might have like used those kinds of spaces. And the existence of those clubs is probably one of the ways that Christianity spread through like networks like that. And then once you had like a wealthier person who had a bigger house, then you would go meet at their house. Just like, when you're a teenager, you go to the friend's house who had all the cool snacks. You would go to the person who had the biggest home. Was it in secret? No. It wasn't in secret.
If y'all take anything away from this interview, take it away.
Yeah.
Take this. It was not in secret.
Yeah, and did these meetings happen at night? Yes, but a lot of stuff happened at night. A lot of kind of sort of dining events happen at night.
Right.
Bacchanalia happens at night.
Have
religious
jobs?
festivals. Right. If you're working during daylight hours, because that's when sunlight's available for you to do your job, then at nighttime is when you do these kinds of things. So the fact that Christians meet shortly before dawn or at night, that's not suspicious at all. That's just kind of normal for sort of religious type groups in this period.
Right. Earlier you mentioned that the governor didn't want Christians disrupting the sort of local economy. And I am curious, I think I know a little bit, but I'd like to know more about how sort of state religion was directly linked to the local economy and how a sort of subversive small sect of people that believe something else could have impacted the economy in a meaningful way.
Yeah. So religion in the ancient world is like water. It's everywhere. And you notice when there's too much of it, and you notice when there's none of it. So when there's a flood, you're like, wow, that's a lot of religion. When you're in a desert, you're like, there's no religion. And so with Pliny, what he's referring to is the fact that religion is involved in everything from, like, if you take, say, a temple, what does a temple do? Well, it's not just a place that you go to pray or have religious festivals or offer a sacrificial offering. It's also a bank. It's also where people store books and official government records. People sometimes live there. Like, there's a lot happening. There are like cottage industries that spring up around it, to say nothing of sex work associated. Like, anywhere that's popular, there are going to be sex workers.
Yeah.
So Pliny had recently constructed, financed, and the entire temple. And people weren't coming to it, allegedly because of the Christians, but it might just not have been popular. And one of the reasons that's important is, the sacrifices often are animal sacrifices. Paul in his letters had suggested that people probably shouldn't eat animals that have been sacrificed to deities, not because they're, like filled with demons or something. It's just, it's confusing and sets a bad example and makes it seem like you're involved in this. So if Christians who apparently kept kosher, and Romans love pigs, so they don't understand anyone who's not eating pork because they're like, it's delicious. And if Christians aren't purchasing any of the meat sacrificed at the temple, they're not paying any of the associated fees of sacrificing animals in the temple. They're not patronizing any of the businesses that are right around it. That's disruptive. And you don't really want that. For Pliny, it seems to be a very local problem. But in general, Christians seem very antisocial, in as much as they won't participate in any of these very financially important religious ceremonies. And they also seem not to be too hot on the military.
Which is weird to think about today. Last question, and then I will let you go because I have kept you over time. Something that I also grew up believing was that tithing was this very normal part of church, and it always has been, it always will be, and that's it, right? And I was sort of surprised to learn that the early church had no concept of tithing. And I was wondering if you know anything about this. You might not.
So they have concepts of donating money for the upkeep of, say, the Jerusalem temple. They get that from Judaism. There are all kinds of Christians who would not have had any money to donate anywhere. So when you think about enslaved Christians, women, children, like tithing, who's money? So there's that issue. But we do see a lot of really interesting financial decisions that aren't very compatible with certain forms of modern Christianity. So not only is there not as much tithing as you would think, even though there are some biblical passages that refer to tithing, people don't really have that money. They have to give what they can. And you see that in the New Testament, the story of the widow's mite. Paul is clearly collecting money from wealthier members in his assemblies to send back to Jerusalem, because apparently that Jerusalem community of Christians is run on like a shoestring, and he's collecting money for them. But then there's the issue that you have in Christianity, even today, if you have very charismatic Christian leaders who want money. And the earliest Christian sources are very clear that if someone comes into your community and they ask you for money, you should turn them out of the community because they're a false prophet. All of which is to say, you probably shouldn't be giving your money to preachers that ask you for it. It's not me, it's the earliest Christian statement on financial running of churches.
Yes, please stop giving money to wealthy pastors, or really to any, but please stop with like the Joel Osteen types.
Right.
Well, this was delightful. Thank you so much for being willing to chat. I learned so much from you, and I enjoyed this conversation so much. Before we go, can you let people know where they can find you, how they can support you?
Oh yeah. I'm on Twitter. Yeah, I'm like an old lady now. I'm on Twitter at Candida Moss or Candida Moss, whatever helps you spell it. On anything, I'm easy to find. Obviously I wrote books. I wrote a book called Myth of Persecution. I'm writing another, like what we call a trade book, like a popular book now on something totally different. So I hope people will be interested in that when it comes out. It's a little bit of a secret. Yeah, just get in touch. Obviously, and I read a column for the Daily Beast, so feel free to read that. And if you wanted to access it for free, it also runs on Yahoo. So it's not paywalled there.
We will link, or I will link all of this stuff in the show notes, including links to your books. I assume you have an Amazon page. I'm pretty sure that's where I ordered it from. Cool. Again, thank you so much for coming on. This has been a blast. And on that note, I'll see everybody next time. Bye.
Oh, shit. You done fucked up, man. Ain't nothing but a gangsta party. Speak no other languages.